March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet over Berlin, and the sky itself is trying to kill you. Up here, the laws of ordinary combat stop applying. The air is too thin to breathe without a mask. The temperature sits at minus 45 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze the sweat on the back of a pilot's neck, cold enough to seize up a poorly built engine before it ever fires a shot, cold enough to turn a simple mistake into a death sentence in seconds. This was home turf for the veterans of Jagdgeschwader 26, the Schlageter wing, some of the sharpest, most experienced pilots the Luftwaffe had left. They flew the Focke-Wulf FW-190, a razor of an aircraft, light, quick, and built to cut through the sky and end a fight before the enemy even knew it had started. Its wings carried 20mm cannons designed specifically to shred heavy bombers out of the air. To these men, air combat was almost a science, and they'd built their entire creed around one idea. A fighter had to be small. It had to be nimble. Weight was the enemy. Agility was everything. This was the gospel that had carried German pilots to victory over half of Europe. And before we go up into that freezing cockpit and watch what happened when the Luftwaffe's finest ran into the American bomber stream over Berlin, we want to know who's watching this with us. This story survives because people keep telling it. And so drop a comment, where are you watching from? And did anyone in your family serve? And if you want more of this era told straight, with the details that actually happened, hit subscribe. That morning, a German flight leader broke through the upper cloud layer and adjusted his oxygen mask, scanning the horizon for bombers. His job was simple: and stop the massive wave of American B-17 flying fortresses currently conducting the first large-scale daylight raid on the German capital. But when his eyes found the escort fighters weaving through the contrails above the bomber stream, something didn't add up. German intelligence had already looked at America's main escort fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and dismissed it outright. When German aerospace engineers first saw its photographs and specifications, they had, and quite literally, laughed. On paper, it was almost comical. Loaded for combat, it topped 14,000 pounds, nearly double the weight of a 190 or a Messerschmitt. Its nose was dominated by a massive 2.0 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine that made the whole aircraft look less like a fighter and more like a delivery truck with wings. By the strict mathematical standards of German aviation, this was a flying joke. German engineers ran the numbers and reached an easy conclusion. This bloated machine would be slow, clumsy, unable to turn, and an easy target for their nimble interceptors. At altitude over Berlin, a German leader spotted a flight of these delivery trucks, P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group, led by a colonel most of the Luftwaffe would soon learn to fear by name, Hubert "Hub" Zemke. His outfit was about to earn a nickname of its own. Zemke's Wolfpack, the German pilot, did what he'd been trained to do 100 times. He rolled his 190 onto its wing and hauled it into a tight, screaming turn, intending to slot directly in behind the heavier American aircraft. This was Kurvenkampf, the turning fight, and by every rule of the game, the lighter, more agile plane always wins it. He expected the American to panic and try to turn with him. If the heavy P-47 attempted that turning circle, its own weight would stall it out in the thin air, leaving it helpless and hanging in his gunsight. The American didn't turn. And Zemke had drilled something into his pilots that broke every rule of European air combat. Don't play the Germans' game. He knew a P-47 couldn't outturn a Focke-Wulf, so he told his men to stop trying. Instead, as the German closed for the kill, the American pilot rolled his 7-ton fighter onto its back and pointed the nose straight down at the earth. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. The P-47 didn't just dive. It fell like something dropped from orbit, and all that weight the Germans had mocked, combined with a nearly perfect teardrop shape, turned gravity into a weapon. In seconds, the American was past 500 miles an hour and gone, vanished from the German's gunsight like he'd never existed. A German pilot shoved his throttle forward and tried to follow, but his lighter Focke-Wulf started shaking violently as it neared the speed of sound. Compressibility, a killer in its own right, forcing him to haul back on the stick just to keep his wings attached. He watched, stunned, as the clumsy American machine disappeared into the clouds far below, completely under control. And the Luftwaffe had shown up expecting an elegant duel. What they got was a new kind of war, one fought up and down, not side to side. Zemke's Wolfpack wasn't interested in turning with anybody. They were going to use their weight to pick the fight and drop out of the stratosphere like a hammer, and be gone before the enemy could even react. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had rewritten its playbook. Diving with the Americans was suicide, so German commanders issued a new directive. Avoid the dive entirely. Rely instead on the Focke-Wulf's superior horizontal maneuverability. Wait for the P-47s to pull out of their high-speed drops, and then pounce from behind with overwhelming firepower. In the rigid, almost mathematical doctrine of German aerial combat, getting on an enemy's tail, the 6 o'clock position, was supposed to be checkmate. Nothing survived it. Nothing ever had. One Luftwaffe veteran managed exactly that over the skies of the German capital. He slipped his FW-190 through the chaotic contrails, pulled it into a tight turn, and framed the massive wide fuselage of a P-47 from the 56th Fighter Group perfectly in the center of his WWII gunsight. He was carrying the Luftwaffe's answer to heavy aircraft, the 20mm MG-151 cannon, loaded with a highly classified round known as the Minengeschoss, or mine shell. Unlike a standard armor-piercing bullet, this was a thin-walled projectile packed with high explosive, engineered to punch through an aircraft's aluminum skin and detonate deep inside the wing or fuselage. And German intelligence had calculated that 3 to 4 of these mine shells were more than enough to sever the wing off any standard fighter in the sky. He squeezed the trigger. A concentrated burst of high-explosive shells slammed directly into the American fighter. The German watched the impact tear jagged, gaping holes into the fuselage. Metal peeled away in the slipstream. Thick, black oil sprayed across the sky. In his mind, the fight was already over. He eased off the throttle, waiting for the American to fold in half, catch fire, and plunge toward the earth, the way any British Spitfire or Soviet Yak would have, under identical circumstances. It didn't fold. It didn't burst into flames. It didn't even flinch. As the smoke from his own explosive shells cleared, the German pilot stared through his armored windscreen in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. The American aircraft was violently chewed up, half the rudder gone, jagged holes, the size of dinner plates, punched clean through the wings. And yet the massive Pratt & Whitney engine up front was still roaring at full power, still pulling the aircraft through the sky in a straight, level line, as though nothing at all had happened. To the Luftwaffe, this was a violation of the fundamental laws of aerial physics. Here's what German intelligence had missed. The P-47 wasn't built like a fighter. It was built like a tank that happened to fly. Designer Alexander Kartveli wrapped the whole aircraft around a Pratt & Whitney R2800, 18 air-cooled cylinders arranged like a wall of steel in front of the pilot. And unlike the liquid-cooled engines in a P-51 or a Messerschmitt, which could be knocked out by a single lucky hit to the coolant lines, the R2800 could lose an entire cylinder to a direct hit and keep running on the other 17. And the pilot himself sat inside what amounted to an armored bathtub, heavy steel plating behind his back, under his seat, and around his head, while self-sealing fuel tanks clamped shut instantly around shrapnel, and starving any incendiary round of the oxygen it needed to start a fire. Realizing his best shot hadn't worked, the German pilot lined up to fire again. But the American, having just absorbed a hit that should have killed him twice over, didn't bail out. He shoved the throttle forward, nosed the wounded but very much alive Thunderbolt into a dive, and disappeared. Leaving the German alone with a very uncomfortable thought, debriefs back at Luftwaffe bases started sounding the same note of quiet dread. A fighter pilot's whole sense of control comes from knowing that a clean shot means a kill. The 56th Fighter Group had introduced a machine that broke that promise every time. German pilots started calling it the Fliegende Lokomotive, the flying locomotive. And General Adolf Galland, commander of the entire German fighter arm, later admitted just how deep the psychological damage went. A German fighter pilot's confidence depends entirely on the certainty that a clean shot means a kill. And the 56th Fighter Group had introduced a machine that simply refused to honor that promise, and it was breaking men one debrief at a time. As one surviving Luftwaffe pilot put it after the war, they had the finest cannons in the world. They got behind the Americans. They fired perfectly. They watched their explosive shells detonate against the wings and fuselage, and the Americans simply flew away anyway. It was deeply demoralizing. We realized we were no longer fighting men in airplanes, he said. We were fighting an industrial giant that was wrapping its pilots in so much armor that our weapons were becoming irrelevant. The Luftwaffe had spent years mastering the art of the precise, lethal duel. Over Berlin, they discovered the Americans hadn't shown up for a duel at all. By late spring 1944, the psychological architecture of the entire Luftwaffe fighter corps was quietly disintegrating. And pilots from JG-26 and JG-2 had already learned the hard way that a P-47 could absorb a direct hit from a 20mm explosive cannon shell and keep flying. But surviving a hit was only half of what made the Thunderbolt so terrifying. And the true fear wasn't what the American fighter could absorb, it was what it could unleash. In German aeronautical philosophy, gunnery was treated like surgery. A Focke-Wulf carried a mix of machine guns and cannons, devastating on a direct hit, but slow firing and limited in ammunition. A German pilot was trained to act as a sniper, close the distance, carefully line up the target, fire a short, precise, lethal burst, and move on to the next kill. The Americans didn't do precision. They did saturation. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group flew P-47s bristling with 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 buried in each wing. To a German engineer, this looked absurd. Why bolt on 8 heavy guns when 2 good cannons should do the job? And the Luftwaffe found out the answer the first time a Thunderbolt dropped out of the sun and opened fire. When a Wolfpack pilot squeezed the firing button, those 8 guns threw out more than 6,000 rounds a minute combined. It didn't produce a surgical stream of fire. It produced a literal wall of armor-piercing and incendiary lead, roughly the size of a barn door, tearing through the sky at supersonic speed. For a lightly built German interceptor, designed to hunt slow-moving bombers, catching that wall meant one thing: an immediate, catastrophic death sentence. The pattern repeated itself again and again over Berlin, with horrifying simplicity. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 would climb to intercept the bomber stream. Above, in the freezing cirrus clouds, a flight of P-47s would spot it, roll inverted, use their weight to accelerate into a near-vertical dive, and fall out of the sky directly onto the Germans' blind side. A surviving German pilot from Jagdgeschwader 2 described the sheer, paralyzing terror of being caught in a Thunderbolt's crosshairs. Against a Spitfire, he recalled, you heard the ping of machine guns and had a fraction of a second to brake hard and dive away. But against the heavy Americans, there was no fraction of a second at all. If a Thunderbolt caught you in its sights, the sheer volume of bullets was incomprehensible. It didn't damage an aircraft so much as instantly erase it. He remembered watching his comrades' planes simply vaporize into clouds of aluminum and burning fuel, the kinetic impact of 8 heavy machine guns firing at once enough to stop an aircraft in midair and tear the wings straight off the fuselage. This was the brutal, unglamorous reality of the boom and zoom tactics Hub Zemke had perfected. The 56th Fighter Group had no interest in a prolonged, turning fight with the German aces. They used their dive speed to dictate the engagement on their own terms, unleashed an inescapable, localized apocalypse of .50 caliber fire, and used their remaining kinetic energy to rocket back up into the stratosphere before the surviving Germans could even turn their aircraft around. By the time Allied troops hit the beaches at Normandy that June, and the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had been bled white, the 56th Fighter Group alone would go on to destroy over 660 German aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other fighter group in the entire 8th Air Force. But their true victory was psychological. A German Jagdflieger had begun the war as the undisputed knights of the air, operating under a code of individual brilliance, precision, and agility. But in the freezing skies over their own capital, they were systematically hunted down by a blunt, massive, and 7-ton flying locomotive that refused to play by any rule they understood. German high command realized, far too late, that the era of the elegant dogfight was dead. The Americans had looked at the delicate and highly engineered fencing match of European aerial combat and rejected it outright. They had bolted 8 heavy machine guns to a 2,000-horsepower engine, wrapped the pilot in steel, and proved to the Third Reich that no amount of tactical brilliance could survive a direct collision with the brutal, unstoppable mathematics of American industry.